I'm reading this 37-year-old comic book called RKL Nightmare, with the N spelled backwards because it is punk rock. Now this comic book came included in this album, RKL Nightmare by RKL, which came out in the year 1987, which continues to be 37 years ago, and I'm going to talk about it today since I produced the record. And it came out on my label, Alchemy Records, and I think the number of it is VM 104, indicating maybe it was the fourth record to come out after Neurosis, Melvins, and Clown Alley. I don't know the exact order. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the experience making that record with the legend that is RKL. In 1987 in San Francisco, RKL was more or less a local band, and they had some band members that lived in Santa Barbara also. They were kind of split in between the two cities, and so they would play dates down there. They'd come up to San Francisco. I think two of the band members lived in San Francisco, and the rest of the guys lived in Santa Barbara or Montecito before it became an enclave of the extremely rich. Anyway, these guys were one of the founders of the so-called Nardcore scene, which was an Oxnard-based punk rock scene in California. I think they did it inadvertently. They were just the best band around, and people started coalescing around them, wanting to play shows with them. And likewise in San Francisco, when they came up there, I think there was a time when RKL was sharing a rehearsal space in the same rehearsal place as Clown Alley was. There was a bunch of bands practicing there. I think maybe the Dead Kennedys practiced there also. Someplace down off of Army Street near South San Francisco or something. Anyway, we got to know people in RKL, and we would go to their shows, and their shows were always great. They were a band that was technically proficient. They weren't playing kind of the technical sort of music that is happening today, but for punk rock bands, they were extremely good players. They played about 100 miles an hour and had intricate arrangements, lots of interesting changes, along with a total punk rock party attitude, which was an interesting combination. And so they knew that I had the record label Alchemy with Victor Hayden, and so we started talking about making a record. And as I got to know them better, interestingly, it turned out that they had had somewhat of a relationship with a label down in Los Angeles called Mystic Records. And in Los Angeles, amongst the punk rock circles, Mystic was known for being somewhat abusive towards bands, kind of taking advantage of them, never doing anything that they said they would do, and yet somehow they still managed to attract bands to put records out. So they were laughingly called Mistake Records. And I knew of this because I actually did a little work at Mystic Studios when I was still living in LA in the early 1980s before Lori Black and I moved up to San Francisco. The main thing Mystic was known for was the guy that owned Mystic was a guy named Doug Moody. And this is some real obscure music history, but he had something to do with the song My Boy Lollipop, which was a big hit in 61 or 62. He was an English guy, and he either produced or co-wrote My Boy Lollipop, and then with some of the proceeds from that, because I think it was a top 10 single, he relocated to Los Angeles from the UK, started Mystic Records and Mystic Recording Studio, which I think had a 1-inch or 2-inch 16-track machine in there. And then he further burnished his reputation by having Led Zeppelin actually do some kind of tracking at Mystic Studios. I'm not sure if it was for Led Zeppelin 2 or Led Zeppelin 4, but he nevertheless propagated this rumor that Led Zeppelin did do some tracking there. I haven't done the required research to find out if that's true or not, but this rumor was perpetrated and people found it interesting enough to want to go and do their little projects at Mystic Studios. Anyway, we had to talk about Mystic and both agreed that Doug was extremely sketchy person, and they had a terrible experience with it, and they were wanting to make a new record. So we started to talk about it. It seemed not really feasible just because the band lived in two different places, and they assured me that this was going to be okay and they were going to figure it out and it would be fine. And I talked to Victor about it, Victor Hayden, my partner in Alchemy Records. And I think we even went to a couple of RKL shows together, and he really was impressed by them. They were extremely impressive live band and pretty much always tore the place up and left everybody with a very exhilarated feeling. So we kind of figured out how to make this work. We just kind of kept in touch. They said they had a bulk of material that they were ready to record, which they weren't, honestly. But they kept saying, yeah, we're going to go for it, man. This is going to be awesome. And they were kind of adjacent to some of the surf culture in Santa Barbara at the time, as well as the punk rock culture in Oxnard, California, and Santa Barbara. So they had like a little bit of a following, including the very young and unheard of local band NoFX, who I will touch on later in this breakdown of what happened making this record with them. So they got to the point where they said they were pretty ready to record, and I think they gave us some demos. The stuff sounded really good. These were just things that were recorded at their practices, either in Santa Barbara or San Francisco. A few times a month they managed to get together. And so we agreed to do this one record with them based on what would happen later. I think we had an option for another record based on this one performing to a certain point and them touring to promote the record, all the usual kind of stuff. So we agreed upon time to record, which was in May of 1987, and we had an extremely tight budget on this, and they were hooked up with a recording studio, or had a friend that ran a recording studio, something like that. And so we just went, well, okay, this sounds pretty good, and the studio could be gotten extremely cheaply. I didn't really realize at the time that in fact it was just a bunch of gear that was going to be moved into a room. And I also didn't realize that previously to that, to the session starting, the bass player had quit the band. So they didn't tell me this. Went down to Santa Barbara all ready to start recording, and kind of looking at the studio and going, oh, okay, it's like this. I probably should have done more research on it, but I just took their word for this being a cool place to record. So I get to Santa Barbara and we're talking about starting the next day or the following day. And I'm realizing, okay, this is going to be fairly challenging to get a good result out of this studio. But I meet the engineer. He assures me he's done this quite a few times and that this can be made to sound really good. And I had my faith in RKL, knowing that they were great players. They were playing challenging music, and also Bomber, who was the drummer of the band and more or less the leader of the band, assured me that, quote, they were going to have their shit together and they were going to get this done and it was going to happen just like we'd spoken about. And I knew Bomber previously a little bit also because of the Melvin's Gluey Porch Treatments sessions where Melvin's came down, we set up the drums in the studio and they weren't going to work. Something was broken on Dale's drum kit. So they knew RKL a little bit, and we called up Bomber and said, hey, can you bring your kit down here for this session? And Bomber was like, I'll be right down with it. So that was an indication of the sort of guy that he was. And he really saved the Gluey Porch treatments sessions because we didn't have money to basically be tossing around for renting a drum kit. So he brought his in. It sounded great. Anyway, he said, yeah, we have a problem with our bass player. And I said, well, what is that? And he goes, well, he's not in the band anymore. So there was this incredibly complex set of material that was going to start to be recorded. And there was no bass player. But Bomber said, but you know what? I got this. And Bomber was a bass player and a guitar player. And I had no idea of his bass playing capability. But he said, yeah, man, I've been practicing like crazy on all the new stuff just in case. I co-wrote most of the songs, so I know all of them. And I went, all right, well, this is an interesting thing. And then another thing that happened was the two guitar players were not going to be available for the initial tracking that was going to happen the next day, basically. So it was me and Bomber in the studio with the engineer. And I said, so what is the plan here exactly with this? Do you have somebody who's going to come in and do scratch tracks? All of this news just started to be revealed to me the day of the recording or the day before. And there was no way to change any of this. We're kind of locked into doing this. And he goes, well, I have an idea. I'm going to throw it at you. Let's just see how it works out. I'm going to play through all of the songs. I'm going to just do drum tracks to all of the tracks by myself. And I went, really? So you know this new material that well? And he was going, I got this, man. I got this. He would be talking to me like that. And I would just be thinking, really, do you though? I mean, I've never actually done this with somebody before, but I just thought, well, worst case scenario, he's going to give it a good solid try. It's going to either fail or not. And in my mind, I was just started thinking of plan B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and just going, okay, I'm either going to be going home tomorrow night and this whole thing is a failure. We're going to have to write off this amount of money and just see how we can regroup to make this thing actually happen. And so there we are in the studio. We get a decent drum sound and I'm going, okay, well, it sounds like drums. Bomber's warming up. He's getting right into the zone and I can see him working himself up into this place where he's being incredibly focused. And I have a list of songs and I've heard the demos, so I'm somewhat familiar with the songs. And I just said, go ahead and warm up, do whatever you want. He sat in there and played for half an hour, 45 minutes, just kind of, I could see him physically going through the stuff, thinking of what certain songs had coming up in them, working on certain parts, and I just let him do it. And I just figured, well, this is going to either happen or it's not going to happen. So we took kind of a break after that, and he said, okay, I'm ready. And I said, you're ready? And he goes, yeah, let's go. And so we basically had all of the songs in order. We had a rough kind of basic sequencing in mind because this was like another step-saving, money-saving thing to do, was just record everything in a sequence, and then you'll have minor editing to do at the very end. So we started running through the songs. We ran through them one at a time, and he just blew through the songs, and really I had no idea if things were being played correctly or not because I couldn't hear any point of references. There was nobody else playing with him. This is a guy sitting in a small kind of drum booth type area by himself going, okay, ready, counting off 4 for a cue to other people, and then just blowing through the songs. And every once in a while he'd stop and go, I think I can do that one better, or he might screw up on a fill or something, in which case usually we'd have to start the song over because most of the tempos were so fast that there was no point allowed for punching in. I think we tried that a couple of times and it just didn't work out. It was easier to just start over. So we just gradually worked through the day like this. I'm not even sure if we took a lunch break or anything. We might have basically just took about an hour's break just to let him recoup and get some more energy going, because this was really, if you listen to the record all the way through and just imagine somebody tracking all those drum parts in one day, it's a really admirable feat, and he just did actually lock in, and he did have it. And at the end of the day, I was pretty amazed with what I had just seen, and it was just really impressive. I've played with some pretty good players, but I've never seen a drummer do that in a day. I mean, this is kind of a throwback to when people like the John Coltrane Quartet would cut entire records in a day. I mean, it was just a absolute monster feat that he pulled off. And so he was we kind of split up, and I still didn't know if I had a record going on or not, because we still did not have a bass player, and he was going, I'll throw down all the bass parts tomorrow. And I was just thinking to myself, okay, let's see what this looks like. Every day was a let's see what this looks like day. And sure enough, the next day, they had a bass rig there. I think maybe they borrowed one or something. And he said, okay, let's go. And so we did exactly the same thing that we'd done the day before. We started working through every single track, basically dialed in a bass tone. It's the same bass tone all the way through. Maybe it changes a little bit through some of the mixes, but he did exactly the same thing. We started in the beginning, and he was just, okay, ready, let's go. And he just nailed all the bass parts all the way through the sequence that we had. And once again, it was an amazing feat. If you listen to it, I wish there was a way to just have the drums and bass soloed, but this is like an ideal thing because you have one guy playing both parts. So they're so locked in together because it's just different parts of his brain doing the same thing. And that's definitely a way to listen to this record that you might not have listened to before, is just listen to drums and bass and imagine it's one guy doing it. So that was 2 days of recording done. And then on the third day, I think finally the two other guitar players showed up, came down from San Francisco. And so then we were able to start doing guitar parts. And it seemed like everything was at an accelerated tempo because this was just Bomber doing it the way he wanted to do it. And RKL was kind of a notorious band for playing right at the edge of things falling apart. They were sort of like sacrilege in that way, where the speeds that they were playing at were just accelerated to this maximal level where it might just, sometimes it did actually fall apart and the whole thing was like a scramble to get back together, but that was part of the charm of it. And the third and fourth day we had guitar parts, and Jason Sears, who was the singer, came in, did all the vocal parts. And so basically on the fifth day, I think we were able to start mixing this. And one of the decisions that happened that was kind of a more or less sort of a radical decision at the time was to not use any reverb whatsoever on the record. And I started thinking about this during the recording of it because the stuff is so incredibly fast. There's no room to create any kind of ambience. I mean, the band are creating an ambience just by their playing. When they do slower stuff, the space is still filled up by big punk rock guitar sounds and just the way Bomber plays. He's a very fill-tastic player, so it's kind of cool to hear what he does with space. So we had this incredibly dry sound for the mix, and interestingly, the louder we were listening to it back, the better it sounded. It seemed to be a really great decision to not go for any reverb at all. I don't think even the vocals have any reverb, or if they do, it's a really, really tiny amount. But everything else is just completely present and as loud as it can possibly be. And the record sounds really good. I just have listened to it for the first time in I don't know how long, and it still has this amazing energy to it. They were super pleased with the mix, and Victor loved the record, I loved the record, and the record came out to generally good reviews. And I think they went out and kind of did some touring for it. I don't think there was actually a legitimate Rock and Roll Nightmare tour. They always were having personality problems in between people in the band. There was a certain amount of drugs floating around within the band the whole time. And this was unfortunately part of the band's history. They had a high rotation of members, and then of course Bomber and I think maybe Barry living in San Francisco and other members living down in Montecito or Santa Barbara didn't help the band's unity much. And just looking at their Wikipedia page, I mean, it's quite the read. I recommend that you read it. Well, I'm concentrating on just my experience with them making this particular record, which was a great experience. And incredibly, the record is nothing but people overdubbing. There's no live playing virtually together as a band on this record, which is weirdly one of the charms of it, because it sounds like them playing together, but once again, it's a testament of what a great band that they were, and they really knocked people out. One of the interesting things in their Wikipedia page that I did not realize was this Josh Brolin reference. Josh Brolin, the actor, who's the son of James Brolin, and there's some place where the Cedo rats are referenced, who are like guys who like to surf and get high in Montecito. And I guess Josh Brolin was one of the Cedo rats and claims to be one of the very, very early pre-RKL members of RKL who maybe played with Jason, who was the singer. And I think he mentions in an interview that Jason was a super close friend of his for a really long time. He also mentions this kind of wreckage that drug usage left throughout that whole scene, which is really sad because it's one of the great what ifs since they were such a good band. On that note, there's also a reference to NoFX, which possibly became the biggest band to come out of that scene. And I remember having a couple of interactions with guys in NoFX. They would be at RKL shows in the Bay Area, and they were always approaching me going, Mark, we really want to be on Alchemy. Alchemy's our favorite record label. And then when they heard that we were doing a record with RKL, they were even more adamant. Hey man, can we just be on your label, man? And they would talk to me like that. And I would just go, yeah. But, you know, I would always make some kind of excuse about why there was no room for them on the label or whatever. But the truth was, at the time, they were just incredibly amateurish. They were just getting started. They could barely keep their guitars in tune on stage. They could barely start and stop at the same time. They were obviously enthusiastic. And so I think it might have even been at some show where RKL played around the time of this recording that happened, that I don't think it was Mike, it was maybe somebody else in the band, came up to me for maybe the fourth or fifth time and said, Mark, you know what I'm going to ask you, man. And I would just go, yeah, I know. And I would just say, well, I'm going to absolutely tell you right now, you guys need a lot more work. And I just gave them a couple of pointers. I just said, work on your songwriting, work on practicing more. You're going to get there. You have enthusiasm. That's at least 50% of the deal. And, good luck to you guys. You have my phone number or whatever. I will see you around. And so in hindsight, maybe I should have taken more of a, interest in NoFX and been more of a, guiding light to them and more hands-on as kind of a helping them get to where they needed to get. But I just didn't have the time. I had a full-time job. I was running Alchemy with Victor, which was sliding off the rails. My band Clown Alley was sliding off the rails. So I didn't have time to just go, okay, I'm going to hang out at NoFX rehearsals and, go, okay, the bass should play with the drummer. Like, listen to what the bass drum is doing. But NoFX got there and turned into an absolutely gigantic band. So great for you guys. And yeah, I know you guys were RKL fans, obviously, and you were right. RKL was a monster, great band that inspired everybody from you guys to Green Day to plenty of other bands. This comic book that came out in the record was a really cool thing. It was all their idea, and we had a pressing and distribution deal with our distributor Southern Records in London, and we suggested that to them, and the guy running the label / distribution company, John Loader, said, I think that's a great idea. Right away, he didn't even flinch. He goes, this will be hard to recoup on, but he goes, this is a great idea. Nobody's ever done it before. Or if somebody has, enlighten me. Anyway, within this comic book, there is a comic strip for every song title on the record. And that is a really cool thing because it gives you a real insight to what it was like to be a punk rocker and deal with your parents and sound men and trying to keep people in bands and getting wasted and hanging out at your friend's house and taking too much of whatever. This is what happens, I guess. And of course, in the end, they've got an absolutely gigantic thank you list, as was tradition for many, many bands in the 1980s. And it was just kind of the equivalent of the modern shout out or the toast. You can see that this one is incredibly long also and has a lot of names that you may know in it. Victor, Hayden, Mark, our parents, the Melvins, NoFX, Clown Alley, Haight-Ashbury Zoop Kitchen. Incidentally, the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic is thanked in here also, which was a famous place to go and get on methadone if you were on heroin in the Bay Area, which many people did. I thought I found the Cedo Punks in here, which was what Josh Brolin said that he belonged to, but they also thank Taco Bell, Sacrilege, they thank Camel Cigarettes, and anybody who came to a show, of course, Verbal Abuse. Thanking Sacrilege is pretty interesting because in here there's even a thing about where they call out some posing metalheads who are wearing Van Hagar shirts and stuff like that, which is sort of interesting, and it shows the cross-pollination between punk rock and crossover metal, which was a super cool thing that happened back in the day. So there's definitely a delineation between poser metalheads and then real metal guys like Sacrilege or other people like Verbal Abuse and stuff like that. So this is a cool thing, and you should definitely, this is kind of a collectible thing. So I'm not sure if there's a way for me to figure out how to get this other than reading the entire thing like I did the Sacrilege thanks list, but I'm going to spare you on that and just know that it is a cool thing and reflects the culture at the time pretty accurately. All artwork, copyright 1987, Dan Seitz and RKL. So I would imagine that RKL had plenty of input on the subject matter of this, and there's probably all kinds of hidden references and in-jokes, I would imagine, down to somebody's mom hating the band and kind of drinking herself to sleep in the afternoon, and Oh yeah, here's them making fun of the metal heads, which is Van Hagar. One guy's got a Motley Crue shirt on. So these bands were absolutely despised. And then they're also kind of showing cool stuff by showing the Bad Brains Eye Against Eye record. So this is an interesting little time capsule and well worth having and paying collector prices for, I would imagine, if you're a fan of this, of course. That is the end of my RKL story. I suggest you read the Wikipedia page of them. It is an interesting read, and they were a great band that influenced people beyond their small ripple that they made in the late 80s, and long may they reign. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe because it helps my channel. And also there's a couple of limited edition shirts. I think there's some left at my Bandcamp page from my Bluebird album and something else. You can also buy me a coffee if you choose to. I love caffeinated beverages. And you can also join my Patreon page where you will find unreleased material, access to this record collection that I am actually writing essays about and putting up files from. So hope to see you again.